Hello and welcome to another episode of the Student Loan Planner Podcast. I wanted to let you guys know that we are going to be rolling out a new podcast called the Financially Free Era Podcast. I'm going to share more details about that podcast, but it's going to be brought to you by SLP Wealth. And we're going to use that podcast to talk about all the stuff that current and former student loan borrowers need to know to grow wealth. So we thought it just kind of made sense, rather than mush the two podcasts together, to split them out and to separate them a little bit and have the Student Loan Planner Podcast be the Travis Rants About Student Loans show that eventually will become uninteresting to you. And then if you are ready to graduate to more wealth building content or get both at the same time, my colleague Megan McGuire is going to be leading the Financially Free Era Podcast. Yes, it's a little bit of a hint of Swiftie fandom in that title, but it's going to be entertaining, fun, and a lot more positive than this podcast, because I'm just grumpy and frustrated with all the changes of student loans, which is what I'm going to talk about today. So let's just jump right in to the student loan portion of the show today, which is, let's talk about scenario planning for the Republican student loan bill that might be coming out of Congress and very well could pass in some capacity. So I wanted to give people a little bit of an update on the legislative process, what's going on, why, and let's talk about it a little bit. So I was corrected by a higher education policy expert who's been in the game a lot longer than I have on X/Twitter recently, that the original IBR and PSLF programs were passed through budget reconciliation and not through the normal legislative process. I was shocked by this because the vote was 79 in favor. And so I had always thought, well, okay, that's a filibuster-proof majority. Well, it turns out that that was a 79 vote threshold that they passed, but it was done through this reconciliation maneuver. Why does that matter? So in the Senate, historically, it's really difficult to get anything done if 40 senators oppose it, right? And if 40 senators oppose it, they've been able to slow down everything. I guess I should say 41 senators, right? Because of the 60 vote threshold for the filibuster. But what's happened over time is more and more and more stuff has become doable with just a simple majority, because, you know, both parties are really frustrated their agenda can't get through. And so both of them, I think, are motivated towards action instead of inaction. And so the senators have continued to push the edge to get more and more things that you can just get done with 51 votes in the Senate. And there's a lot of examples of this on both sides of the aisle for different things. And, you know, reconciliation is this maneuver to get around the filibuster, basically. And the problem is you can only use reconciliation, you know, a certain number of times a year, and there's limitations as to what you can put into it. And so both parties tend to stuff absolutely everything they can possibly stuff into one big, giant reconciliation bill. And, you know, and then they get very little done besides that. And that's just sort of like the nature of modern American politics. So basically, everybody's got these big incentives to stuff anything they can stuff into this big reconciliation bill, and it's just extremely intense political street fighting over what goes into it. And then the House passes their version, the Senate passes their version, the White House is pushing both chambers to do what it wants, and then everybody comes up with a final bill. So in the version of the Democratic version of this in 2021, American Rescue Plan, President Biden wins. One of the promises he made was, I'm going to make this big, giant, aggressive push on, you know, the pandemic and protecting Americans economically, health-wise, et cetera, right? So also there was all this encouragement of the idea of President Biden being the, you know, the second coming of FDR, right? And so he wins, he's got unified Democratic control, tons of political pressure in that environment to do something, right? So in March, they passed American Rescue Plan, and, you know, some stuff didn't include it, but a whole lot of stuff did. One of those things was making student loan forgiveness tax-free, which expires at the end of 2025. And this is specifically for private sector forgiveness. PSLF is tax-free based on the PSLF law, so you don't have to worry about that if you're a PSLF borrower. But why did they kind of shove that tax-free forgiveness into the reconciliation bill in 2021? Why'd they do it? It's because Senator Warren and her staff and staffers that, you know, she helped install, along with other, you know, progressive leaders in the Democratic Party, helped install at Department of Ed, knew that if they wanted to do anything big on student loan cancellation, some of this kind of stuff that they were going to do, they needed to correct that part of the tax code to make sure that they wouldn't generate massive tax bills for Americans if they just tried to cancel debt, right? So it was critical for the part of the stuff that President Biden, his administration wanted to get done. And in particular, the progressive base of the Democratic Party that the Biden administration knew that they were going to need if the president wanted to run for re-election in 2024, right? So he was very incentivized to try to hold on to that progressive enthusiasm, or at least hold on to their support. And student loan forgiveness was kind of like a proxy for all of President Biden's political troubles, basically, because it was, he struggled with younger borrowers, progressive borrowers, and student loans are just this sort of easy kind of like issue button that he could just press and be like, look, I like young people, I like progressives, look at me, I'm doing what people want, right? So the bill that got passed through reconciliation, American Rescue Plan, simple majority, and it had a time limit on it, only until the end of 2025, because of all these limited rules and things, right? So now you have student loans, and I always operated under the assumption that you had to have an expiration date in a reconciliation bill. Well, apparently, because things like the PSLF program were started through reconciliation, you actually can make permanent changes to student loans via reconciliation. That's news to me. I'm a little surprised. I'm being vulnerable right now and saying, wow, I am not a legislative expert. I know Excel stuff and student loans pretty well, but the intricacies of, the Senate rules, I'm not an expert on. And so I'm always learning things like you and relaying them to you when I discover them. So if the current Congress with a simple majority wanted to completely eliminate PSLF, they could. Now, there's a question as to whether or not that would be violation of contracts. According to a lot of student loan lawyers I've been talking to, apparently the current Congress can do a whole heck of a lot more than really what it should be able to do because of the Higher Education Act, which basically kind of sort of throws in a bunch of language about how the Congress can modify it kind of however it sees fit. So a normal contract that applies between a private lender and a borrower does not apply in the same way that the contract exists as between a federal student loan and a borrower. So that's messed up, but it is what it is. And so what you need to know is that the current Congress could just destroy a bunch of stuff if it wanted to. So given that it could destroy a bunch of stuff if it wanted to, what is the actual proposals that we are looking at right now? Right now, the most conservative proposals coming from the House GOP. And this is not a good proposal for a lot of high debt borrowers, but it's not a disastrous one. It is just a very not good one. And let me explain what I mean by that. PSLF is still active. For future PSLF borrowers, it would be way harder to get forgiveness, but at least existing borrowers would probably retain access to forgiveness in most cases. Existing borrowers, if the House GOP bill were to pass, it would put absolutely everything, it would put everybody into the old IBR plan. So it would put everybody into the old IBR plan, so everybody would have to pay 15% of their income. It does take away the payment cap on that plan, so people would be able to sign up for that even if they had too high of an income to qualify. Normally for old IBR, the cap would be removed. That would actually help some borrowers for like PSLF cases where people are attending and they make way too much money to qualify for IBR. So that's actually in some ways a positive thing. Now, the not positive thing is that they would take away pay. They would take away new IBR. They would force everybody into 15% of their income. Or you could switch into the new repayment assistance plan, the RAP plan or the RAP plan. The RAP plan, RAP, is the acronym that the House GOP is saying for their IDR plan. And what that RAP plan would do is say 10% of your income if you make over $100,000 a year, and then it's 1 to 10% of your income if you make less than $100,000 a year with a sliding scale. So 50K to 60K of income, 5% of income, 60K to 66% of income, etc. Right, like that, all the way up to 10% of income. Now, there's no discretionary income anymore. It's literally just what's on your AGI minus, a little bit of a deduction if you have kids, like a $50 a month deduction per child. So it's a very different formula for calculating student loans than we've seen in the past. There is interest subsidies like the SAVE plan in some ways, where if your required payment's less than your interest, the government covers all the interest. That's and the difference between those two numbers. Now, the principal subsidy is way less generous than initially what we had seen. They're only doing a principal subsidy of like a maximum of like $600 a year, and most people wouldn't get it. So you're getting, a very small principal subsidy. Loan limits are also heavily reformed in this proposal. So professional school borrowers would only be able to borrow up to $150,000 if you're not already enrolled in a program as of July 2026. Undergrads get to borrow a little bit more than what they're borrowing currently, which is a little bit of a positive. So, if I had to summarize this bill kind of in a short way, undergrads benefit slightly from this bill. Not compared to the SAVE plan, but compared to the rules that existed, pretending the SAVE plan is dead, right? Graduate and professional school borrowers get absolutely annihilated in this bill for future borrowers. Existing borrowers just get mildly hurt. Well, maybe not mildly hurt. That's probably not the right word. existing borrowers get really punched in the face, but not like in a way that causes you to lose your eyesight, if that makes sense. I mean, like hard punch to the face, but going from 10% of your income on pay to 15% of your income on IBR really does one of two things, right? To most people. Most of our audience could afford that. It would not be pleasant. It would not be fun. You would rather use the money on much better things. But most of our audience could afford that. The folks who are going for forgiveness for sure that have over 2-to-1 debt to income ratios, regardless of if it's IBR or pay, you're still going for forgiveness. The only question is how much will you have to pay? And if most of our folks that have professional degrees, it would not be pleasant, but you could pay 15% of your income, right? So that's when I say it's very bad. This bill proposal is very bad versus disastrous. Disastrous would be no IBR plan at all. No sort, nothing at all. That would be disastrous, right? So very bad in my mind is no more new IBR or pay, and everybody has to get onto old IBR or switch to the new GOP plan. And, in the case of PSLF eligible borrowers, there's a chance that the GOP plan, 10% of income, might not be all that different from the pay and the new IBR plan, right? Potentially. Now, like for people who, the 15% would pose a big challenge. I mean, so I think that the deal that people would have to think about is people in this 1 to 2 times debt to income ratio world, right? If you have between 1 and 2 times your income in student debt, that's the group of people that could be, forced into a repayment instead of forgiveness if this bill were to pass. Because that's, what I used to tell people is, well, if you have over 2-to-1 debt to income ratio, pay off or go for forgiveness, right? And then with Biden administration, with the SAVE plan, it was just if you have more debt than income, if it's more than 1-to-1, go for forgiveness. And now with this new proposal, if it were to pass, it would be kind of back to the 2-to-1 debt to income ratio. Now, the problem is if you have a very partisan bill that's passed, like this one would be, the problem is a unified Democratic control of Washington could completely revert all these rules and move us like in law to the SAVE plan, right? They could literally make the SAVE plan law. Like if, for example, Congress had opted in March 2021 to create the SAVE plan, from, during the reconciliation process, if they'd codified it into law, they could have done that because the GOP is doing this. And so a future Democratic Congress would almost certainly, in my mind, repeal everything the GOP did and make the SAVE plan law. Well, if you should be going for forgiveness if you have more debt than your income, then since we know there's 3.5 years left of the Trump administration, that means that you might want to keep your loans federal, even if you were forced into the old IBR plan. If there's any potential that the SAVE plan could make a difference of you going for forgiveness versus not going for forgiveness. Now that's probably mostly people in the 1.5 debt to income ratio to 2. But in the 1 to 1.5 debt to income ratio, people might just say, you know what, screw it, I just want to pay this off. And that'd be a reasonable reaction, right? But you definitely want to get all the 0% interest that you qualify for first. And you want to milk that SAVE plan forbearance for all that it's worth. And know, too, that this is a proposal. This is not law yet. And it won't be law. This exact proposal, I'm almost sure will not be law because the Senate's going to have its say. And the Senate's going to want to share what it thinks should happen, right? And the Senate thinks that what should happen is just the repay plan. The Senate wants everything to go back to the repay plan because that was, the plan President Obama proposed in his very last year in office. And that plan kind of realized, well, we want to subsidize the interest, but not like too much. So we're going to do a 50% interest subsidy instead of 100%. And, we're going to do 25 years of graduate school to limit the bad incentives for people going for forgiveness. And we're going to exclude married filing separate, to make it harder for people to get forgiveness. And, 20 years for undergrads. Well, that's basically like what the final view was of the Obama administration as to what the repayment plan should look like. So the Senate Republicans who are, opting usually for more moderate proposals than the House GOP, reason being, average House member is from a district that's like 20% more Republican than Democrat, and then average senator is like from a state that's like, 5% more Republican than Democrat on average. I'm just making those numbers up. I'm not sure what the exact numbers are, but that, GOP House members from a way more partisan district on average than a Senate member is, right? So the senators, you tend to propose more moderate stuff than the House does. And the Senate's just like, can we just go back to like the Obama repay plan? Like that would be cool with us. Like, can we just go back to that? But the problem with that is the House is super opposed to forgiveness in any capacity. The House does not want to hear the word, the GOP House does not want to hear the word forgiveness, does not want to hear the word cancellation. The efforts of the Biden administration were something politically that they really hardened their opposition to the whole idea of student loan forgiveness because of just the Biden administration tried to take it much further than prior administrations, and that really activated a bunch of political opposition among the most conservative members of the House, right? And so, I think the GOP wants the operating word to be like very little forgiveness, like make it way harder to get forgiveness, make it way harder for the government to even lend a bunch of money to people, right? That's why they proposed 150K loan limits, because they want the government out of the business as much as possible with the professional school entirely. Now, of course, the problem with that from an economic mobility standpoint is the, people that are first generation, second generation, borrowers would not be able to attend a lot of professional schools, at least with the loan limits. For example, med school, dental school, vet school, for example, those are 4-year programs. You have to borrow for 4 years of living expenses and 4 years of tuition. So if you borrow $30K a year for 4 years, it's $120K. And then if you throw on like tuition on top of that, well, what's the cheapest, med school in the country? If it's $20K a year, that's $80K of borrowing. So $80K plus, $120, you're already over the limit. $200 and the limit's $150, and the $150 limit is lifetime. So that would count, undergrad borrowing, I believe. I have to double check to make sure of that, but I think it does. And so essentially, anybody going to, a doctorate level medical program of any kind, it's a longer term program that's more expensive, they would be subject to the whims of the private markets to be able to attend at all. And so that's one of the reasons why I think that the final plan will be different, because I think the Senate's going to want higher loan limits for this exact reason. And I think that the House, the one thing I'll say I very much appreciate about the House GOP's proposal is that they do preserve married filing separate, because if you don't preserve married filing separate, that's a disincentive for people to get married, for one, right? If you don't preserve married filing separate, then anybody in a domestic violence situation would have to pay based on their spouse's income too, and they would have to get income information from their spouse, from their joint tax return, to be able to pay their loans. And that's, we've seen what happens when you have a joint consolidation loan that you cannot separate after divorce. It's just a giant mess. So I do appreciate that the House GOP bill did acknowledge that and include the ability to file separately for taxes for student loans. That's one real positive in terms of them being fair with this new legislation. Now, I don't think they were fair on everything. I don't think it's fair to roll back what was promised to borrowers when they signed up for school. Like if you go to, dental school and it says on your promissory note you can do the pay-as-you-earn plan, you're going to borrow based off of the promises that were made to you. Now, if you have those promises reversed, I don't see how morally that's different from a bank that says, hey, we really regret making that 3% mortgage loan to you because interest rates are so high these days. We really need to reprice your mortgage at 6% so we don't lose so much money. That's what it feels like, right? And, it's one thing to say, well, it's tax policy, taxes change all the time. Well, this is a loan, and it really should be thought of as a loan. And I think that it's very unfair of the House to try to strip borrowers of existing loan options that they've, borrowed under. So I guess what I would hope to see in the Senate version is some sort of grandfathering, true grandfathering, and they could do this by just codifying the pay-as-you-earn plan and codifying the new IBR plan for. So in other words, I'm going to give an example. They could, in the reconciliation bill, just say, okay, we're going to end the ICR statute completely. We're going to say, anybody that's on the pay plan can get access to new IBR. So that way you could get rid of the ICR statute, and then everybody that's on pay could just switch to IBR and have the same payment terms, basically. And then, anybody else, including, Parent Plus borrowers and those kind of folks, give them the option again on the old IBR plan, because otherwise you're going to have a bunch of defaults and it's going to be a big collections nightmare, and it's just going to be stressful for everybody. And you're probably not going to collect all that much money anyway from a lot of the folks that have the highest balances. So, 15% of income for 25 years is at least survivable in retirement. And, the ICR plan, 20% of income, way lower poverty line deduction, really isn't. So, so hopefully they do something that acknowledges grandfathering and, protects people that borrowed under the rules that they thought were promises to them. And I think that that's reasonable to expect. Now, for the final results, like when the Senate comes out with its version, House comes out with its version, they conference, iron out the differences. what are the chances that student loans are in the final bill? I think that student loans will likely be in the final bill in some capacity, which means that there's some big legislative change that will probably happen, and it probably will happen this year because there's a September 30th deadline for reconciliations to happen according to the normal process, whatever. Don't ask me why, but that's kind of what I've read. So, September 30th is the date that we'll know something. We'll probably know something, though, before then. We'll probably know because they're targeting, complete passage by like July 4th, right? So if we see a Senate version probably later this month or early next, and then ironing out the differences of those two bills, you get a final bill that, has to be, I believe, voted on again. Gosh, I have to relive civics class, right? And then, you'll have the opportunity as a constituent along the way to share your views about each of one of those drafts. And we'll definitely make sure you're aware of that and have the opportunity to contact your elected officials and let them know, let them hear what you believe should happen and how these changes could impact you, right? And then finally, once the House and the Senate has passed their, jointly agreed upon bill, it goes to the president's desk, right? Remember that like old song that you sang about how a bill becomes a law, right? So it goes to the president's desk. And then obviously with, a House and Senate controlled by Republicans, whatever final version they come up with is something President Trump will sign. And this is being called the Big Beautiful Bill because the reason why they're calling it the Big Beautiful Bill is really kind of like a PR messaging strategy. They were initially talking about doing two separate reconciliation bills. One that was going to address a bunch of like immigration-related stuff that's a little bit less hot button than tax policy is. Hot button meaning like, there's probably more agreement among Republicans around like, immigration kind of stuff than there is around tax and spending policy, where there's just a lot of different views. Like that's another thing of this bill, might get scaled down in such a way that it sort of doesn't reform all that much. And let me explain that scenario. So there's the hardliners in the House that are very, very conservative, right? That are from like R plus 40 districts if you're like a 538 kind of, fan, right? Or Real Clear Politics, right? Like, R plus 1 is a district that's 51% Republican, basically. And then, R plus 40 is a district that's, I don't know, 70%, Republican, for example, right? So the most conservative members in Congress fear a primary challenge more so than the general election. So those members are super, super hardcore about wanting huge spending cuts, particularly things like student loans, Medicaid, health spending, that kind of stuff, right? So the really, really hardline members are pushing for enormously big cuts to spending. And then the more moderate members know that if you cut Medicaid by a huge amount of money and you shut down a bunch of rural hospitals, shut down a bunch of, care for lower income borrowers, that's going to be real unpopular among moderate voters, right? Really unpopular. And they'll probably lose their elections as a result. And so the moderates are pushing back saying, I am not going to go and run for re-election in a 50-50 district, in a purple district where I've got to go explain, not only the tariff policy, but I got to explain why we cut Medicaid by hundreds of billions of dollars, why people can't get, seen by their doctor anymore, that are low income because of this vote that my party took, right? So they really, really, really don't want big spending cuts, the moderates. And that puts everybody at loggerheads. And the problem is in a normal sized majority, you might have, 20, 30 seats to spare with your vote margin in the House. But this majority, they have 3 or 4 votes to spare. That's hardly any at all. And so you're hearing about names that you would never hear about in a normal, political environment, like random libertarian-leaning members of Congress that vote no on everything. And you're hearing about, all these just sort of random representative names because in a majority that's only 3 or 4 votes large, basically almost like any one of like hundreds of people are kingmaker in that scenario, right? You can you and a couple drinking buddies, could hold up the entire like legislation for the whole party if you wanted to, and it doesn't matter. Like if you don't care about your political future, they can't do anything really to you significant if you're willing to sacrifice your seat, right, for the future. So, anyways, I think that we're going to see all this battling within the Republican caucus over what's going to go in the bill. And recall that when the Democrats were in charge, they had a moderate majority. The moderates basically won, right? The moderates shot down for some things, like the American Rescue Plan was sort of more of a progressive win, and that did come early in the President Biden's term. But after that, the moderates sort of like took all the power, right? Because you saw Build Back Better fail. Like all these different legislative stuff failed, besides, things that are a little bit sexier like infrastructure bills, and, the Inflation Reduction Act was exciting because of, clean energy kind of stuff. And it wasn't, as polarizing as tax policy. So tax policy and spending policy is polarizing for the Democrats too, because you got moderates that don't want to go nearly as big as, the very progressive members. And then Republicans, of course, their conservative wing wants to go way bigger on tax cuts and spending cuts than the moderates do, because they know they'll lose their seats if they go too big. So you might see the whole reconciliation bill collapse on itself. It won't completely collapse, though, because the Trump tax cuts do expire at the end of 2025, and so they will be forced to write something. Something will pass, no question in my mind. Something will pass, even with the 3 or 4 vote majority. The question is do they take all the controversial stuff and they just strip it out, right? Medicaid cuts, screw it, let's take it out. Let's just add a little deficit financing. Let's, cut taxes, but maybe like a little bit less, right, than we were planning. Let's let some of the tax cuts, expire to take away some of the messaging that we're only helping the wealthy, right? Like maybe we'll keep the top tax rate at, 38 instead of, 39.6, and it's higher than 37. So we can say, well, we didn't let, all of the Trump tax cuts get, renewed. We just, kept the best ones or something like that, right? You can see the messaging compromises that might happen if the Congress, with the Republican caucus can't come to agreement on things. So I know things are really confusing right now. I know a lot of people have questions about their loan counts, about the IDR account adjustment tracker going away on the student aid website. People are worried about, the forbearance types that can count for PSLF buyback. People are wondering about processing times. People are wondering about, some people are worried about double consolidation or wondering about Parent Plus loans, Grad Plus loans. There's all kinds of things that people are asking questions about. If you want to ask a question for the Student Loan Planner podcast, where we can feature that question, hopefully give you an answer live on one of our future shows, go to studentloanplanner.com/voicemail and leave your question there. And I will try to answer as many of them as I can. And I just wanted to encourage you that, big rules for student loans still work. Over 2-to-1 debt-to-income ratio, forgiveness. Under 1-to-1 debt-to-income ratio, pay them back, unless you're an edge case for PSLF. Between 1 and 2 debt-to-income ratio, it depends. And it's going to depend on a lot of things, and it's going to be different for each individual person based off your risk tolerance, life goals, career goals, emotions, psychology, etc. We're going to be here for you every step of the way. Even if I have to rub Tabasco sauce in my eyes to stay awake with reading all these crazy challenges, because they're going to come fast at us. All the legislative news, it's going to be really intense for like a month or two, and then we'll be able to breathe a little bit easier. At least we'll understand what the rules are. Even if we don't like the rules, we'll at least know what they are for a while. So we'll keep you updated. Thank you so much for listening to the Student Loan Planner podcast. Hope you have a great rest of your week. Are you on the free Student Loan Planner email list? If yes, you could upgrade your experience and discover student loan loopholes so good, they might get repealed if I talk about them publicly. Find out my very best thought leadership that I really just can't be super open about anymore, unfortunately. If you want to get our very best tips, not just the ones that I can share for free, then go to studentloanplanner.com/insider to get a special discount for your year membership. That's studentloanplanner.com/insider and get our very best dozens of bonus content and tips that's going to save you money and get you out of student debt faster. And if you're already an SLP insider, please reply back to those emails and let me know how I can make it even more valuable.